1912. The Admiralty, London. October. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, is signing an order that his own naval staff has told him is premature, reckless, and potentially catastrophic for British naval preparedness. The order authorizes full production of a 15-inch naval gun for the new Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. Not a prototype run. Not a limited trial batch. Full production. 8 ships worth of guns and turrets, ordered into manufacture before a single barrel has been loaded, before a single shell has been fired, before anyone outside the Vickers design office in Sheffield knows with certainty whether the weapon will function as designed. The Director of Naval Ordnance has told Churchill that standard procedure requires 18 months of prototype testing before committing to production. Churchill has told the Director of Naval Ordnance that Britain does not have 18 months. Germany is building. The advantage that the new 15-inch gun will provide over the 13.5-inch weapons already in production will be lost if the British wait for the trials that professional caution demands. The order is signed. The guns go into production. If the design is wrong, the most important class of warships Britain will commission before the First World War will be armed with weapons that do not work. If the design is right, the Royal Navy will have the most powerful naval rifle afloat, deployed at a scale Germany cannot immediately match. This is the story of the most consequential unsigned test certificate in naval history, and why the gamble that should have failed instead defined British sea power for 47 years. The decision Churchill forced through in October 1912 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of a specific strategic calculation about the direction of German naval construction and the timeline available to the Royal Navy to respond to it. Germany's 1912 naval building program had moved toward larger caliber guns on its capital ships. British intelligence assessments, some accurate and some significantly overstated, suggested that the next generation of German battleships would carry guns of at least 14-inch caliber, the 13.5-inch guns being fitted to the Iron Dew class, then under construction as the latest British battleships, would be at a disadvantage against larger caliber weapons in any fleet engagement where both sides could choose their firing range. The mathematics of naval gunnery in this period were straightforward. A larger shell, all else being equal, delivered more kinetic energy to the target at the point of impact. It penetrated armor more effectively at long range, where velocity had been reduced by air resistance. It contained more explosive filling and created more destructive internal damage on detonation. The Navy that could put a larger shell on target at longer range controlled the terms of the engagement. Churchill's calculation was that moving to 15-inch guns on the Queen Elizabeth class, rather than continuing with 13.5-inch weapons, would give the Royal Navy a caliber advantage over any German ship it was likely to face before 1916. The risk was that getting to 1916 with the new guns in service required skipping the trials that would have confirmed the guns would work. To understand why the decision to order without trials was more calculated than it appeared, and why it succeeded when it should not have, you have to understand the specific nature of the risk Churchill was accepting. A prototype trial for a new naval gun caliber in 1912 required manufacturing a single gun barrel and mounting, firing it through a series of test charges at progressively increasing loads, measuring the pressure curves, the muzzle velocity, the barrel wear rate, and the accuracy characteristics at various ranges, then using that data to refine the production specification before committing to the full manufacturing run. The process typically took 12 to 18 months. What Churchill and the Director of Naval Construction, Eustace Tennyson D'Eyncourt, understood was that the 15-inch design being ordered into production was not a radical departure from the 13.5-inch guns it was replacing. The same propellant system, the same basic breech mechanism, The same rifling pattern and the same turret mounting principles had been used on the smaller caliber weapon with a thoroughly documented performance record. The 15-inch gun was, in its fundamental engineering, a scaled-up version of a proven weapon. The risk was real. The risk was not as large as it appeared from outside the design office. The Vickers engineers who had drawn the 15-inch Mark I were the same engineers who had drawn the 13.5-inch gun. They were scaling up a design they understood to a caliber they had not yet tested. That was different from designing something entirely new, and Churchill knew the difference. The Queen Elizabeth class, whose armament hung on the untested gun decision, was itself a departure from convention significant enough to generate its own set of critics within the Admiralty. The class was designed to burn oil fuel exclusively rather than coal or a coal and oil mixture. Oil gave more energy per ton, required fewer men to operate the boilers, and could be transferred at sea in ways that coal could not. It also required a supply infrastructure that did not yet exist in 1912, and it made every ship in the class dependent on oil imports that could be disrupted in wartime. The machinery fitted to achieve the class's design speed of 25 knots was more powerful than anything previously installed in a British capital ship, and it had been pushed to the limit of what the hull dimensions could accommodate. The armor scheme had been revised to concentrate protection over the most critical areas at the expense of coverage elsewhere. Every major design decision in the Queen Elizabeth class had been made at the edge of available knowledge. The 15-inch gun was the final element of a design philosophy that accepted risk at every level in exchange for a step change in capability. Churchill had not signed one reckless order. He had signed a reckless program, and the 15-inch gun without trials was the part of that program that most clearly illustrated how the whole thing had been conceived. If you are enjoying this look at how Britain's most important naval procurement decision was also its least orthodox one, a quick subscribe helps the channel keep producing deep dives like this one. The first confirmation that the gamble had worked came in the spring of 1915, when HMS Queen Elizabeth completed her gunnery trials in the waters off the Scottish coast. The 15-inch Mark I performed within the parameters the Vickers engineers had calculated before a single barrel was manufactured. Muzzle velocity on standard charge measured 2,458 feet per second, exactly as specified. Barrel pressure curves fell within acceptable limits throughout the test program. Dispersion, the spread of a salvo shell impacts around the aim point at various ranges, was tighter than the 13.5-inch gun it had replaced, tighter than the 16-inch guns that would be ordered a decade later specifically to supersede it. Barrel life measurements taken through the trial program projected a service life of approximately 335 full charge equivalent rounds per barrel. That figure, when it was later compared against the barrel life of Germany's 38-centimeter gun on Bismarck, which lasted approximately 180 to 210 full charge rounds, would prove to be the single most consequential specification in the entire design. The gun that had been ordered without trials had been designed correctly. The calculations made in the Sheffield drawing office, without the benefit of prototype firing data, had produced a weapon more durable and more accurate than anything its rivals would build with full trial programs in the following 2 decades. The operational proof arrived at Jutland on the 31st of May, 1916. The 5th Battle Squadron, 4 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, each carrying 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, engaged the German battle cruiser force under Admiral Franz Hipper at ranges up to 19,500 yards. That range exceeded the effective reach of the German guns by several thousand yards. The British 15-inch shells were arriving on German ships before Hipper's gunnery directors could establish accurate return fire. HMS Barham struck the German battle cruiser Lutizzo with a 15-inch shell that contributed to the accumulated damage, eventually forcing Lutizzo out of the battle. HMS Warship, her steering jammed by a hit, circled twice in front of the entire German battle fleet and absorbed 15 or more heavy shell strikes, her 15-inch turrets continuing to fire throughout the ordeal. When her steering was restored and she cleared the worst of the engagement, not one of her main turrets had been permanently disabled by the hit she had taken. The guns that had been ordered into production in October 1912, without a single trial round fired, had survived conditions their designers had never tested them against, and kept shooting. The caliber advantage that Churchill had predicted when he signed the October 1912 order proved real at every engagement where the 15-inch Mark I met a comparable weapon. At Calabria in July 1940, HMS Warship struck the Italian flagship Giulio Cesare at a range of 26,000 yards, the longest confirmed hit ever scored by one moving warship on another in naval history. The shell had been fired by a gun designed 28 years earlier, from a ship commissioned 25 years earlier, using a barrel that was approaching the end of its service life, but still performing within the accuracy specifications the Sheffield engineers had calculated before the first round was ever fired. The Italian Navy's 15-inch guns, designed in the 1930s with the benefit of 2 additional decades of ballistic research, achieved no comparable long-range hits at Calabria. They achieved no hits at all, their dispersion at long range degraded by the high muzzle velocity their designers had chosen in pursuit of maximum range, a choice that accelerated barrel erosion and reduced accuracy in precisely the conditions where accuracy mattered most. At Cape Matapan in March 1941, HMS Warship, HMS Valiant, and HMS Barham, all three carrying the 15-inch Mark I, caught the Italian heavy cruisers Zara and Fiume at 3,000 yards in darkness. The 15-inch guns at that range delivered broadsides that the Italian cruisers had no time to return. Both ships sank before their turret crews could load their guns. The weapon designed for long-range fleet engagement performed with equal effect at point-blank range, in complete darkness, against a different class of target entirely. No performance specification written in 1912 had anticipated the Cape Matapan engagement. The gun did not need to have anticipated it. The engineering margins built into the design, the same margins that produced the barrel life figure and the dispersion figure that outperformed every rival, were sufficient to cover operational requirements that no designer could have predicted in 1912, and no trial program could have tested in advance. The comparison against Germany's equivalent weapon closes the argument that the Admiralty's critics had been making since October 1912. The 38cm SKC-34 gun fitted to Bismarck and Tirpitz was designed and manufactured in the 1930s using metallurgical techniques and ballistic knowledge unavailable to the Vickers engineers in 1912. It fired a lighter shell at higher velocity, achieving a flatter trajectory and longer maximum range at the cost of higher peak chamber pressure. That pressure drove barrel erosion at a rate that limited each barrel to approximately 180 to 210 full-charge rounds before replacement. Bismarck fired 93 heavy shells in the Denmark Strait engagement on the 24th of May, 1941, and approximately 8 more in her final hours on the 27th of May. She was sunk before any of her barrels had reached 100 rounds. The 15-inch Mark I barrels on HMS Warship that fired at Jutland in 1916 were replaced on schedule after accumulating their full service life of rounds. Their replacements fired at Calabria and Cape Matapan. Those replacements were themselves replaced before Warship went to Normandy in June 1944. The gun that Germany built with full trial programs to supersede British 1912 technology wore out its barrels in a single engagement. The gun Churchill ordered without trials outlasted the war, and every German ship that carried a gun designed to replace it. HMS Vanguard, the last battleship the Royal Navy ever commissioned, was completed in 1946. She carried the 15-inch Mark I in modified turrets that had been built in 1916 for the battle cruisers Courageous and Glorious, stored at Rosyth through the interwar years, and reinstalled on Vanguard's hull with new remote power control systems and updated fire control integration. The gun had been in continuous Royal Navy service for 31 years by the time it went aboard Vanguard. It remained in service on Vanguard until her decommissioning in 1959. 47 years of front-line operational service, from the drawing offices in Sheffield in 1912 to the decommissioning ceremony at Portsmouth in 1959, with 2 world wars of combat between. No other naval gun system in the history of any navy achieved continuous operational service across that span of time, beginning with a production order signed before a single round was fired. What the 15-inch Mark I proved across 47 years was not that Churchill had been right to ignore professional caution in October 1912. He had not been right to ignore it. The correct process required prototype trials. The correct process existed for reasons that were valid, and that Churchill had overridden for reasons that were expedient rather than technically justified. The gun worked because the Vickers engineers had made correct calculations, not because skipping the trials had been the right decision. What the 47-year operational record proved was something more precise than that. It proved that the specific engineering choices the Vickers engineers had made in Sheffield in 1912, the choice of moderate muzzle velocity, the choice of maximum shell weight, and the structural margins built into the barrel and the turret design, were the correct choices for the type of naval warfare that followed. Those choices had been made before the first prototype round was fired, inside a drawing office in Sheffield, by engineers who understood the trade-offs well enough to get them right without testing. The critics who demanded trials before production had been procedurally correct. The gun that was produced without those trials was operationally correct in every specification that mattered. Both things were true simultaneously. Churchill's signature on the October 1912 production order was the wrong process producing the right weapon, and the Royal Navy spent 47 years demonstrating that the weapon was right, while the debate about the process became, with every passing decade, increasingly academic,